Let me ask you a question. Have you ever looked at the PlayStation Portal and thought, that thing is so ahead of its time? Yeah, no, me neither. But there's been a product that I've been reviewing for the past few months now, and every time I sit down to write the script, I pick it up to reference it and then start playing games, and I don't stop, and then the script doesn't get written and the video gets delayed, but I finally got around to it, and again, it helped me understand what ahead of its time kind of means, at least in terms of gaming consoles. Today, I'm going to talk about the PlayStation Vita and what it's like to use in 2024. Early on in my review process, this thing actually left such a good impression on me that I did an initial impressions video, and I don't usually do those for older products. I save those for new products where I get my initial thoughts out, kind of lay down my first experiences with setting it up and things I noticed, and then I write a full review later once I have more experience. I pretty much never use that process for an older product because, well, most of the knowledge is already known, but this thing really impressed me to the point where it got the brand new product review treatment. And it deserved it. I mean, for starters, just taking a look at the hardware, I would normally say it's great, but I did also get a chance to mess around with the PlayStation Vita 1000, and that is significantly heftier. The build materials are just that little bit better, and it feels overall a bit more premium. It became pretty clear that this was the cost cutter version, but it's still good. Just not as good as the PlayStation Vita 1000. But then if you think about it, that means that Sony kind of knocked it out of the park with the first iteration of the PlayStation Vita and then cut costs back on the second generation. That's kind of wild. Really though, there's only a few things on this that make it feel like an older product. The proprietary media from Sony, the 960 by 544 display, the headphone jack still existing on it, and a micro USB port. But to be fair, Sony still uses proprietary media for stuff that they really shouldn't, but you know, it was, I guess, novel back then and just still irritating today. Although I'd be willing to forgive the display on this thing because it looks really good, and considering the games were made for this resolution of display, you really don't notice it after a while, especially considering that it's a 5-inch display, and that resolution, while it is low by today's standards, is only a few pixels shy of what the resolution of the iPhone 4S's Retina display was from the same year. So take that for what it is. The Vita Slim's display, though, is still not as good in terms of color as the OLED display on the original model, which again just goes to show how much Sony really nailed it with the first generation and then cut costs on the second generation. But this still isn't a bad display by any stretch of the imagination. It gets more than bright enough, more than dim enough, and again, because the games were made for this resolution, they play great and they look fine. But if we get back to what aged well, the buttons are so good on this. They're very clicky. I would put them on par with the Nintendo Switch. And I would put the Joy-Cons almost above the Nintendo Switch just for the fact that they don't stick drift. I did have to replace the joysticks though, not for any mechanical issues, but because the rubber tops that Sony used started to suffer from rubber aversion. So when I played, they would get sticky and it just felt really gross. And thumbstick toppers keep you from moving the joysticks to their full movement rotation. So I ended up buying some replacements, and it was pretty easy to replace aside from Sony's ribbon cable fetish, and now this thing is fantastic. The thumbsticks feel great, the buttons are really good, and aside from the fact that you're missing some triggers, it's just the two bumpers here, it feels fine to play, and considering the games account for no triggers, it's just bumpers, you're really not missing out on much. I did mention in my initial impression videos that the speakers were speakers. However, I didn't realize at the time that the right speaker was not actually playing because the pins inside had been bent down because I guess somebody's already opened this before me. You know, the downsides of buying things used. But when I got the speaker to work again, it actually was quite a difference. These speakers are really good for this device's size, and considering they're facing right at you, you get the full stereo sound effect for things like Need for Speed and things like Gravity Rush, where you hear an enemy to your left or to your right. So good speakers, better than just saying they're speakers like I did in the last video, so color me impressed. I just, wish that they hadn't broken and that I had to fix them. The only control on this that I didn't really use that much was the back touch surface, and that's just because a lot of games didn't use it. Borderlands had a use for it, and I think that was about it. Actually, no, I think you could also use it in Flower, but I was more likely to use just a regular button or even just the touchscreen itself. So I can see how this was sort of something that Sony threw out there for people to use, and then developers just really couldn't come up with a good use for it. So it's there, but yeah, it's a gimmick in a way. So generally the hardware on this thing has aged surprisingly well. I wouldn't even say surprisingly well. I think it is aged as a lot of people who saw this product early on would have expected. It's stayed really solid in terms of build quality. The display has aged really well considering the games were made for it. The buttons are great, but my PlayStation 1 buttons still feel fantastic. So Sony's no stranger to making products that hold up over time, with the exception of some recent examples like the jet engine fans on the PlayStation 4. So, yeah, I would say that in terms of hardware, it was definitely ahead of its time, and it's kind of its time today when it comes to hardware, but hardware is only half the story. Let's talk about the software. I mentioned in my initial impressions video that the software was very of its time, and that is still true. I still believe that. It's very skeuomorphic, but also kind of futuristic. You have 3D models for the actual icons, so they kind of jiggle when you switch through the pages. It's got this sort of paper look for the overlay. It's kind of cool and it's intuitive, don't get me wrong, but nowadays with the newer, flatter designs and things having fewer outlines, fewer shapes, and everything just kind of being flat and semi-transparent, this definitely feels like it is very of the 2012s through, well, even in 2019, I think this would have been a little aged, but early 2012, I think this was completely reasonable as an interface, but this I don't think was ahead of its time. Funnily enough, though, the web browser does still work for some web pages, which is kind of impressive. It's not great, but it does work. You can, of course, load up Google and Internet Archive to go to older websites that do kind of work, but I can't imagine, even when this thing was being made in 2019, browsing the web on it, it's just, oof. I will say one of the software features I do like is the fact that you can set different wallpapers for each of the pages. So for the default page I have with just all your pre-installed Sony apps, I just have the default wallpaper from Sony. And then on the games, I have sort of a vaporwave city skyline look. And then when you go down to my unofficial apps, which we'll talk more about later, you have the Matrix background. I know Android can do stuff like this, and this is sort of Unix-like in terms of its build, so kind of similar to Android, but it's just cool. And visually, it lets you know what page you're on without having to kind of look at the icons. I don't know, maybe I'm weird, but I think it's cool. But the home screen is just part of the experience, and again, not to beat a dead horse, but it is very of its time with that peel to unlock and peel to close app animations and just the apps in general. It's cute, but we've kind of moved past that to more flat designs. But there are a lot of cool things you can do outside of just the home screen, obviously, like games. The games alone are one of the things that really did bum me out that this didn't actually succeed more as a product, because games like Gravity Rush are so good. If you have a PlayStation Vita and you haven't played Gravity Rush, you're really missing out. It is a fantastic game, and they did remaster it for the PlayStation 4, so you do have a chance to play it now without having to use a PlayStation Vita, so that's good. But there is something cool about the whole pointing the gravity with the gyroscope when you're floating around. That's just such a cool little thing, and I played through the whole thing. In fact, during one of the sessions that I was supposed to be writing the script, I completed the game. So yeah, it's a really fun game. And actually, reviewing the PlayStation Vita also rekindled my love for Jet Set Radio. I had not played that game in so long. I played it on the original Xbox, and they have it on the PlayStation Vita, so it was a blast to go back and play that. And it also kind of rekindled my love for Minecraft, which, if any of you have played Minecraft and have ADHD like I do, you know that that's not a good thing to be rekindled, but, well, it was. Like, honestly, gaming on this thing is a blast. Obviously, I delayed this video a couple times because every time I would write the script for it, or at least start to write the script for it, I would reference the console and then start playing games like the Attack on Titan game or SAO or any number of games. But when you actually take a step back and look at the bigger picture, there's a bit of a problem with gaming on this thing in 2024. And that's the fact that it kind of just seems like Sony doesn't care about it anymore. Like, I personally couldn't get into the PlayStation Store with my Vita, and from everything I could tell, you can't add funds either, so you just can't buy games on the PlayStation Store on the Vita at all, but you can still buy cartridges from resellers who are charging a lot of money for those cartridges. So getting these games legitimately is getting harder and harder, and even trying to get them legitimately when you do find them means it is quite the investment. So then with that, I guess it's time for me to reiterate my beliefs on piracy, because with something like the PlayStation Vita, Sony has completely abandoned it. Nobody's making money on it anymore except for people reselling games at a ridiculous markup because they're collectible or not made anymore. Sony's not making a penny on these things, and they're closing down the PlayStation Vita store if they haven't already. There's no way of getting these games new or for retail price from any direct publisher or from Sony themselves. So going and getting games from other methods, in my opinion, is fine. I'm not going to condone it one way or another. I'm not going to say yes or no. I think it's fine because the console is just dead at this point in terms of support. But I know Sony probably has some different opinions on that. Either way, that is my opinion on that in its current state. Now, if this was brand new and you could still buy games published from companies directly from them or from the store, online or retail, whatever, if you could still legally get these games brand new and not have to pay a markup because they are no longer being made and some third-party dude wants to sell it at a massive markup, if brand new was an option and then you're doing it the other way with some jailbreaks and stuff, that's wrong. That is piracy. No, that's bad. Don't do that. But on a dead console, it's kind of a gray area. And again, I know Sony would probably beg to differ, but well, if they want to beg to differ, then they should keep the PlayStation Vita store open. Just saying. It's also great for homebrew, moving along from getting games from elsewhere. You can also do homebrew, which is really cool. I watched a couple people who were doing a bunch of homebrew games that I couldn't figure out myself, but if you have more of the technological brain to dive into homebrewing, it's pretty sick. Though I did download 2D Halo. That was kind of an interesting game. But the idea that this is no longer supported anymore and you can put other software on it does really show that people really loved this device, and even though it was ahead of its time and killed off, in my opinion, a bit before its time due to its poor timing of release between the PlayStation 3's end of life and the PlayStation 4's start of life, even with all those factors and the fact that it was a sales flop, I think that with the potential that's being unlocked with new software and the hardware aging gracefully like a fine wine, those two things combined kind of cancel out the of its time software and really do make it ahead of its time for 2012 and kind of its time in 2024. Like, if you get a chance to buy one of these, it is a really good piece to add to a modern portable gaming collection. If you have something like a Steam Deck or an ROG Ally, you can play all the newer titles that are more PC focused on the go with some really good battery life, or at least reasonable battery life depending on the game. And if you want some really polished games that perform arguably only a little bit better than the PlayStation Vita, you can have something like the Switch. But if you want some good, sort of not as heard of games, or at least forgotten titles that only came out on this thing, and you want to take them on the go and play, this thing is great. Get yourself a Vita to SD adapter though, because that's sort of a must for these things, because 1 GB of storage in this ain't gonna cut it. And actually, I just mentioned battery life with the Steam Deck, and I totally forgot to write a section about the battery in the script, because if something works as good or better than I expected to the point where I just kind of forget about it, I kind of forget to put it in the script, and that was the case with the battery life on this thing. So, little rant here. Sorry if it's not on script. It's going to be a little weird compared to the rest of it, but here we go. So on this, I was able to play a ton of different games, just kind of hopping around, having fun for hours before charging this thing. And I could play through an hour or two of a game, put this thing in sleep mode, set it down, go to bed, get up the next morning, go through my day, pick it up towards the end of the day, and still pick up playing that game with 60, 70% battery. This thing is a battery monster. And from what I could see from Wikipedia, it looks like it was rated for 6 to 8 hours, which is better than what the OLED model was rated. But I mean, back in the day, that was actually kind of considered low compared to things like the Game Boy or the DS. But 3 hours of indie gaming on something like a Steam Deck, or 1 hour of Halo Infinite on something like the ROG Ally, versus 6 to 8 hours of Need for Speed or Gravity Rush. Oh my God. Like, can we get back to this, please? This is really good battery life. But anyway, that's kind of my rant. It was so good that I forgot to write it in the script, because you just kind of forget about it if it's really good, and yeah, I just kind of forgot about it. But great battery life. In fact, I haven't plugged this thing in 3 days and I'm at 65%. And I feel like some of that battery draw has been just from having the display on to show in the video. So, good battery life. Either way, wrapping this all up, bringing it into a nice little summary, this thing was, yes, very ahead of its time, and unfortunately kind of resulted in its failure back when it first was launched in 2011 for Japan and 2012 for everywhere else. But looking at it now in 2024, this thing kind of falls right in line with some of the stuff that we see today. Quality games, which you can't really take for granted nowadays, fantastic battery life, some older hardware, but generally a very clean and very comfortable gaming experience. If you get a chance to get your hands on a PlayStation Vita, either the first one or the second one from a pawn shop or eBay, or yours is sitting in the drawer and you forgot about it from years ago, pick it up, play it, get some games for it through whatever method you deem viable or just, and you're gonna have a blast with this thing. I have had such a fun time reviewing this, and I'm glad to finally have this video done because it took me way too long because I've just been enjoying playing this. And if I were to recommend some titles, I would say Need for Speed, Gravity Rush, Jet Set Radio, and any of the SAO games, at least so far. I haven't gotten far enough in, so if they get bad later, sorry. The Attack on Titan game's also been a blast. And also I've been trying to beat Steins Gate on basically anything that can play it, so I'm playing through Steins Gate right now, and then next up is Steins Gate 0, and then Chaos Child. So pretty good lineup of visual novels as well, but that's neither here nor there. Either way, this thing is a fantastic console, even all the way out in 2024, and if you have the chance to buy one, definitely hop on it. They are still worth it. And if you feel like paying 80 bucks for a cartridge, go for it, even though they were like 50, maybe 60 when they were new. Otherwise, this is not too difficult to open up a little bit. But either way, that's been it. Thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know in the comments, do you all still have a PlayStation Vita? Do you play it? I'm actually kind of curious because this thing has been a blast, and I'm kind of sad I missed out on it during its original relevance, but who knows? Maybe there's going to be a resurgence later and people will start making even more games in homebrew for it. But until then, thanks for watching. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, all the YouTuber stuff, and I'll see you all in the next video. Thank you so much for being here, and have a good one.